Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This is Charles from the channel Books on Stereo. I almost forgot my channel name for a second. I'm here today with Samantha from the channel Books with Samantha, and we're gonna do another in conversations topic video. I don't know, I think that's what we'll call the series, and we're gonna be talking about do historical romances, do they need to be historically accurate? So they're kind of backwards. So I will go ahead and start us off. I would say no. They do not have to be, because I would say in all the historicals that I've read, how many of them do they actually teach you a lot about the time period?
Mhm.
And they just focus on the romance, and it just happens to be set during like the Victorian or some type of like era that's never really explained. But what are your thoughts?
So I can understand both sides. I can understand how people say that romances need to be historically accurate, but in my like personal opinion, I would agree with you in saying no. For me, a romance, I want you to make me believe in the couple and believe in their relationship. I'm not so concerned about like the outward settings or if the
Mhm.
dresses that they're wearing is historically inaccurate, but I can understand how some people get a little irritated. So.
Mhm. Yeah, I think one of the reasons why I was curious about this topic is because with the success of Bridgerton and how they kind of address race in the show a little bit to some degree, but it's breaking from like the norms that was set in the book where all the characters were white. They put Simon and Daphne, the TV version, on the book cover, and I know a lot of readers were like, "Wait, I thought Simon was supposed to be black," and then they read the book, and it's like it's a whole cast of white characters, and I think that kind of made me realize I'm like, is it really necessary that you have to follow like strictly what would have been appropriate at that time, or do you just need enough where it could be considered historical? Because at the end of the day, it is fiction. I think
Mm.
that feeds into your comment about it's really about the romance. It's really about caring for these two characters
Yeah.
and believing in their romance. The romance is the main story, not all the historical details. So, in my mind, why couldn't you have like a Victorian set like the Duke and I, and the heroine could be Indian, and then the hero could be Chinese or something like that,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it just be the thing. Like, why is that? Like, why do you have to always? And then I feel with like minority authors, they always have to feel like I feel like Beverly Jenkins, her books, like she would have to be more I don't even know, historically accurate
Yes. I
to
love
make
that.
her stuff more believable.
Mhm. Mhm. I
But I
love
don't
that
see the
you say
same thing with like white authors. Sorry.
that. Because if you look at if you okay, so if we look at history and we look at like the most popular time period of historic romance, I think it's Regency. And
Hmm.
maybe like the Victorian a little bit. It's very white. It's very
Hmm.
one particular way. And that it does really lend to interesting stories because at some point we're going to run out of ideas. At some point we
Hmm.
are going to get tired of the same hero portrayed over and over again. And if you look at what was like historically accurate, we read a Judith McNaught book for the book club that I did,
I remember that.
and her love interest is her cousin. And if you think, yeah, yeah. So if you think about the historical accuracy, they were, marrying their
That was
cousins
the
or
thing.
cousins. That
Hmm.
was a thing to keep it in the
Yeah.
family. But is that really romantic to read about? No. So
No.
I think there is some creative license that romance authors get. And I've noticed with a lot of authors of color, I love that you pointed out Beverly Jenkins because I actually have one of her books right here. Almost all of her books at the end, she has an author's note that is almost like her citing all of her
Her
facts and where she
sources.
got her history from. And you don't
Mhm.
see that in any other books because a lot of the complaints with like some of her books was that in this particular book the main character is free and she is also a landowner, and everyone was saying how
Oh,
unrealistic that was for a person of color. And I'm like, if you're
right.
getting so caught up in like the little tidbit facts of historical accuracy, you're losing what is really like a beautiful love story, you know what
Sorry.
I mean?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting that you point that out, because I think that it points out just like kind of like a racial double standard that
Mhm.
exists within the industry. If it was white characters, no one would have an issue with that. If for all the Duke romances that are out there, I'm like, first off, all these Dukes are probably not all good looking. Like they
Exactly.
probably have missing teeth. Like that time period isn't as glamorous as you think. A lot of historicals tend to focus on like the upper class, a very rich class that already have a ton of money. And it's
Hmm.
like you don't think like just in general, like I think for most of the historicals, I think none of them really taught me a ton about the specific time period.
Yeah.
Like I didn't even know what like the Duke, the Marquess, the Viscount, what all those titles on the hierarchy meant. I was like, oh, he's rich. So like, okay, a Duke. That's basically like a billionaire or something at that time. So like there already is a suspension of disbelief because it is fiction. So I'm wondering why is the market so saturated with like even authors of color, you see the trend not just in historicals, but they write mostly white characters.
Hmm.
And historicals, you see that I would say it's getting better now, but definitely like a lot of the big hitters, like okay, they're all white characters. One's probably a duke, someone high titled, and the other person's probably and the heroine's probably like a well off, like has no problem. She's just a wallflower, but she still has a ton of money, and she thinks she's so bad looking, but she's actually really great looking.
Yeah.
Um,
The typical formula.
it's like the typical formula. So I'm like, why can't we? That's why when I watch Bridgerton, I'm like, why didn't Julia Quinn just do this?
Hmm.
Like, why not make the character black instead of like you don't have to focus on the historical realities of minorities at the time because spoiler alert is probably not great for most minorities throughout history.
Yeah.
So I'm like, why can't we show more stories and normalize that behavior?
Yeah. I think when people say that they want things to be historically accurate, they really need to think about what are they saying and are they excluding a large group, or marginalized people, because there were no Latinas, there were no people of color who were dukes realistically
Mm-hmm.
in this historical accurate world that a lot of these people
Mm-hmm.
are creating. And I feel like as times changes, we need to change the books that we're reading. And it always bothers me a little bit when someone really goes hard on an author for historical accuracy in a romance,
Mm-hmm.
because we have fantasy books and sci-fi books that kind of just get this like dragons and witches, and they're just going to completely extend their disbelief for that, but they can't extend their disbelief for a person of color having a happily ever after. You know what I mean? Like it's just,
Yeah.
I feel like it's not so important to like nitpick on the details that it is the romance. As long as I believe in the romance and there's a general setting, I feel like I'm okay.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder the reason why you don't see that is I feel like romance is one of those genres where people think it's heavily bounded by a certain set of rules or
Mm-hmm.
certain set of things that that audience wants. So like by that I mean there's a reason why you see a lot of Duke, a lot of wallflower romances, certain tropes like enemies to lovers, stuff that fits like so I'm wondering if there's like if you like when like if you do put a person of color, I feel like a lot of romance readers who read historicals may go like, wait, but that's not historically accurate. Like how you mentioned how people came for Beverly Jenkins for a black woman owning land. Like I feel like that suspension of disbelief would just not be there for for those types of books. So that's why
Mm-hmm.
you just don't see them that often. But on the other hand, it's kind of like that just shows like an inherent like I would say bias that
Yeah.
comes out when you talk about historicals because I think if you do want to include, I think there should be more minority stories, but they don't have to always be limited to like someone being a slave, someone being oppressed, someone going through racism. Why can't they just be in like the Julia Quinn book and just be whatever minority race they can be? I just wonder if they like romance readers' expectations like make it so that authors don't do that.
That's a really good point. I do think that romance readers, their expectations are kind of in a box in some sets, especially with Regency. Regency, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
if we look at the Regency time period, it was only 9 years. That is such
Mm-hmm.
a very
It's such
short
a short
time
time.
period for people to be obsessing over and to have things be like 100% accurate. And I don't know. I just think we're missing so many stories if we continue to go. I love historic romance. I love all types of historic romance, but I feel like there's more than just like dukes and wallflowers. And if you don't extend your disbelief, if you don't allow the author some creative license, you're going to miss that. You're just going to have the same stories repeated over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think to some degree, not like I would not say all romance readers, but we're kind of like creatures of habit. Like if you pitch a book to me, a historical, and you say XYZ, I'm like, okay. I'm so like I don't even pay attention to the racial factor. I could just imagine the characters as being like whatever I want. But yeah, it's like I don't know, it's a hard conversation to have because like I get it being historical, but on the other hand, like you said, you're missing so many other narratives. And now you have to bring in POC authors to come into this space, like Adrian Herrera is coming out with Latinx. I think historical, right? I think
I
a
think so.
trilogy
Yeah.
or something like that. I know you have Beverly Jenkins, you have Stacey Reed a little bit, doing some really interesting things in that space. And then outside of that, I think you only really get Regency, Victorian, and then a little bit of Gilded Age.
Yeah. I feel like
A
Gilded
little
Age
bit.
is more popular now because I don't really see that many like older Gilded Age books.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But in general, it's like I feel like the contemporary space in romance is just leaps and bounds compared to historicals. Like we're very much stuck in the like Duke, like we said, like the Duke, the Wallflower, the Marquess, the Viscount, especially with Bridgerton. Now everyone's just flocking to those books, and then it's gonna happen again. They're gonna go into YouTube and say, "Oh, who's Beverly Jenkins? Like, what are all these books like with diverse characters? Like, oh my goodness, Courtney Milan, who?"
Yeah, like okay, so the reason I love Beverly Jenkins because she puts a lot of history in her books, and I actually think that makes her books better. So I understand when people say they want books to be historically accurate because I feel like it enhances the setting and it enhances the story, but also like I don't know how to explain it. I feel like if this isn't like I'm reading historical romance as an escapism read, I'm reading it for, the couple. So I feel like I'm not writing a college essay. I don't need to like break
You don't need those
down
facts.
all of the details. I feel like that's just not fun. It is historical, but it's not historical fiction. It's not a classic. Like I just feel like they have a little bit more creative liberties to get our characters to a happily ever after for sure.
Yeah, I definitely 100% agree with that. Honestly, romance it requires so much suspension of disbelief that like just the fact that every couple has a happily ever after. Like I would say most of the historicals do not contain that much historical history tied within the plot. They may have like a little bit for just based on some authors, they do tend to like take like they actually do like source research and actually look at things like saying like, oh, like this would have been popular this time, or looking at like brothels or something like that. So there is a little aspect of that, but I would say most historicals tend to be like, I would say not light and fluffy. They can be a mix, but they tend to be like about the romance. Like who cares? Like some of these books, I'm like, you don't even like what is even really the difference between Victorian and Regency. Like I haven't even come across where a book explained that in a historical. Like some of the basic things that I think you should know if you read a ton of historicals. Like I don't think you would have gotten from reading a ton of historical romances. If you ask most readers, like what is an order of like hierarchy, like in terms of like the titles or whatever, most people would be like dukes. Is that it? Like, what's a viscount? What's a viscount or something? Like it's just stuff like that.
I always say Viscount, and people would roast me for saying Viscount. I'm so sorry, everyone. It's Viscount.
See, but like you wouldn't have known because historical romances like don't teach you this stuff.
No.
So it's like, how are you like? So like that's why I find it like kind of hypocritical for readers to come back and say like, I wish you included more history in this. I'm like, there's authors who do that, and then there's authors that don't include any real historical facts in their books.
Right.
Like I'm kind of tired of like, oh, I can't be seen alone with you because it'll ruin my nature. Like, come on. I was like, really? I was
What
like,
if
there's some things that only exist in romance to push the romance forward.
what I find really interesting is on the flip side, you have the group that actually complain about historical romance because they say it's not relatable and that the way that people talk is very old fashioned, and it's hard to connect to something that's in a separate time period. So I feel like authors really have to juggle being historically accurate, but also not being so historically accurate that they lose the reader's interest. Because I mean, there's words and like dialect that probably wasn't as common in historical romance, but it needs to be adjusted for the reader to be invested into the story. So I think that romance readers, they really have like an not unrealistic expectation, but they're putting a lot on the author on these very minute details. Like as long as it's not so unrealistic that it's taking me outside of the story, like they have freaking technology and the Regency time, like internet or whatever. Like as long as it's
like they pull out a cell phone.
Yeah, they're just talking on the phones. As long as it's not wild, I don't care.
Okay, and like to add on to that comment, how many contemporary romances that you see feature almost the same trope that you see in historicals, and then people go like, I can't relate, like the super alpha hero and the super submissive heroine. That's like a ton. You see a ton of that in contemporary, but then put in historical, everyone's like, why is her rights so restricted? Why is like I want her to be more modern sensibilities. I'm like, have you not read some of the dark romances that are out there? That they literally thrive off that stuff. So it's like, I get the language barrier, but hey, it's still English. Like, come on. It's not like they're speaking like Korean or something. It's still English. It's a different cadence. But I actually like find the writing in historicals to be usually a little bit better because you just have to like match the tone. I think that's the one thing that I would like have to like make sure that's in historical. It has to be written like in a vernacular that seems like it would be in that time. I don't want my heroine to say LOL, what WTF. Like that would take like that's like the minimum that I need. Like it has to sound at least somewhat to that time period.
Yeah. And there's so many tropes in historical romances like marriage of convenience that you just don't really get in contemporary. It doesn't make a ton of sense. No, so to me, historical romance is more romantic, like just that time period. But it's because we made it romantic, not like women were heavily, heavily suppressed during that time. But nobody wants to read that. Nobody wants to read about a woman being suppressed and marrying their cousin. Like, why are we striving for historical accuracy when we could create something better? Like, I don't understand.
I think that relates right to your comment. It's escapism, essentially. Like romance is pure, if it's done well, it's pure escapism. Like you get to separate yourself from reality, enter into this fantasy world where all the characters have happily ever afters. You see all your favorite side characters get their own happily ever afters, which is not realistic at all in real life. So like there already is like a certain inherent like unrealistic quality to romance a little bit. Not to say it's not realistic, as people do have those stories, but for most people, like especially in historicals, like I don't think like the random girl that's just like happened to be like, I went to the ball and I caught the Duke's eye, but no, I don't want him. Like it's like that story in and of itself is fiction. I don't think most authors like pull like a nonfiction document talking about this one couple and like they say, oh, and in this book on da da da, they actually did this. Like so, like no, there already is a like a suspension of disbelief. So it's like weird. It's nice if you get that added bonus of a historical context, but I don't think it's necessary. So I think you can do whatever you want.
I completely agree. I was looking at like articles like, you know, just seeing what other people thought, what was like the common answer to this question. And there was one, I don't want to say what the book is because I've never read it, so I actually don't know if it's a good book. So I'm not gonna recommend it. But she had this time travel historical romance, right? So it's a modern day girl time traveling into historical romance, not Outlander, but
Mhm.
And I guess they were peeling potatoes in one scene, and the time period was in the 1400s, but potatoes weren't introduced to England until the 1500s. And like an
Oh my
author went
goodness.
on a rampage about how, a reader was like, potatoes weren't invented till the, or not invented, but not introduced to England until the 1500s. I'm like, if you're so concerned about
Yes.
potatoes, like, you're not interested in the story. Like,
Just read nonfiction if you want that.
yeah.
Like
Yeah.
really, I get I like really potatoes. They had a problem with that.
I know. It just like if that one thing is going to take you out of the story, then maybe this genre isn't for you. That's how I feel. Because I'm like, I'm not interested in reading about the same thing over and over again. History,
Mhm.
it already happened. Like, let's do something better. Let's create stories that are romantic, and escapism reads. And like, I don't need to be so focused on every minute detail, if that makes sense.
Mhm. I think a lot of that romanticization, because I feel like everyone who loves historicals always mentions Jane Austen. Like that's like the holy grail. Like you are not a true historical romance fan if you haven't read Pride and Prejudice. Like I get it, it's like one of the OGs, but like I feel like so many people use that as a basis, and that's all white.
Yep.
So everything's like that's just how historical romance looks like.
Yeah.
Like you don't have these rooms for these other people of color stories in these books. But I was like, I don't like that narrative, but like I get it because that's where a lot of a lot of people. I think there's probably like a dozen Emma retelling, Sense and Sensibility, Persuasion. What do
Right.
you name it? They've been done like 20,000 different times, and those are like the gold standard. Like, but yeah, like
Yeah,
I
I
think it's
think we
just
can
ridiculous.
acknowledge the validity of a good historical romance that intertwines the love story as well as historical accuracy. I think we can acknowledge it and we can appreciate it. But I think there's also a place for new versions of story that feature people of color, and not even only people of color, but like most of historical romance is heterosexual. So like we need
Yeah,
to even discuss the options of like different, like queer stories.
different couples. Hmm.
And people really want to, and I feel like people attack the people of color and like the queer stories more. Um,
Hmm.
but it's really just like, are you really that concerned with historical accuracy, or are you more upset about something else? You know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
we need
Yeah,
to.
like let's check yourself. Like let's see
Yeah,
what's really going on here. Why
exactly.
you have an issue with these books?
Yeah. But another comment I see a lot is a lot of people say that historical romance is cheesy and it's just like bodice rippers and just about sexy times.
Oh my.
So I feel like with authors like Beverly Jenkins that are giving you like the history and the actual facts,
Hmm.
it makes it more special, and it kind of like dispels those
Those
wrong,
like
wrong um,
hmm.
bias. So I feel
Hmm.
like there is a balance. There has to be a balance of something that's historical accurate and that's interesting to read about. There's not like one formula when it comes to books.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would have to say like you can come against romance. I feel like romance is the easiest one to make hot takes against.
Yep.
But like, you could say the same about YA. YA has like obsessive need to like put every single character on the page in some type of couple. There usually is like the chosen one trope that is like
No parents.
so prevalent in almost every like fantasy, sci-fi, what have you name it. There's always like the parents are dead, especially in YA, and they're
Yes.
just never around. Like, okay, like you can pick out any like commonalities like across all genres, but I feel like romance knows what it is, and I think it's probably one of the hardest genres to write because you just don't have all that extra stuff. You can't like construct like a brilliant plot to like get these two people to fall in love. A lot of that comes with like chemistry, dialogue, banter, nonverbal communication that you just can't rely on. And then they looked into each other's eyes, madly in love, battle, 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 battle. Okay, but they're back in love. They break up, battle, or something like that.
Yeah, very character
So,
driven.
so I think it's like unfair to like take that hot shot against historical romance because I just think in general like there's always bad apples to every genre,
Hmm.
but romance sells like a ton of books. And I think Bridgerton proves that there's an audience for this type of content that's already been there. And not everyone's like, oh, what are these Bridgerton books?
Yeah.
And like just like the whole way the romance especially historical romance, the whole market is super affordable to buy these books. Like they're usually like $8 to $5. They're really cheap, especially for like new releases.
Yeah.
You can't even buy like for adult hardcover of like Gone Girl. That's like $22 right there, where I can get like three historical romances that are about the same length and just as good as in quality for much cheaper. But it's not any less valid, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I completely agree. And I think the people who are, I think they're just nitpicking. Like, even with Bridgerton, I've seen comments where people were upset about the music, that the music was too modern in the background. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
it's a story. We get, like, we have, this is a show. Like, keep me entertained, keep me invested
Mm-hmm.
in the romance. Like, I'm not concerned about what the music is playing. Have you ever seen the show Reign about Mary, Queen of Scots? It's on Netflix.
Oh, that's that the king dies in that one, right? And then she remarries or something. Yeah,
Yeah,
I know that one.
yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. So
Hmm.
everyone, that's a very popular show, but like the dresses that they wear, everyone's like, that's not historically accurate. The dress she's wearing was this time period. And I'm like, it's a show. Like, it's fine.
I swear, like there has to be someone hating on everything. I'm like, I think you have to realize the intent behind the book. Like if like Beverly Jenkins, her intent is to inject some historical knowledge into her readers. That yes, people of color were having love stories at this time, but there's
Exactly.
also like your Tessa Dare, who's just giving you a fun rom com historical romance.
Hmm.
That doesn't necessarily it's not necessarily meant to teach you anything. It's just historical. So I'm
Right.
like, I just think the genre needs to do better or at least include more authors of color that don't have to be feel bound to having to be like this was historically accurate for this time or even publish more historical romances that are not Eurocentric because we get most of the historicals usually take place in England. They're
Hmm.
usually like some like variation of Duke. Sometimes you get some Scottish romances mixed in the middle, but like I would say the predominant ones happen in London, like or England in general.
Yeah.
Like, what does historical romance look in China or Africa or Mexico or Latin America or whatever you want to call or wherever you want to go? So I think we as readers just need to be the ones who actually want to see this change, like supporting those new books as they come out. Not that you, because I will say this, like I love some of my regular historical romances. Like I love Elizabeth Hoyt, Tessa Dare. Like I love those authors. I'm not going to stop reading them, but I think it's time that we see more diversity just reflected on the page.
Yeah, exactly. And like, I don't want it to come across that I don't like the typical historic romance because I do. One of my favorite
Hmm.
books is Elisa Kleypas. Like, that's one of my favorite historic romance authors, and she
Yeah.
almost writes all of her historicals in England. So I definitely like it, but I think it's good to have options. It's and like you said
Hmm.
with Beverly Jenkins, these romances were happening. You know, people of color
Yeah.
were having love stories and were having epic stories and lives that deserve to be written on paper. So it's good to have
Hmm.
options, is what I think. And we
Hmm.
get options with pretty much every other genre: fantasy,
Yeah,
sci
we do.
contemporary.
Hmm.
So I just don't understand why we can't have that in historic romance as well. I
Hmm.
think.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's like way more flavor
Hmm.
in terms of like what is being published in other genres. I think YA is probably the one that changed the most over the past couple of years. Just like what they offer, I was like, most of those books are like better than a lot of adult books that are published, and the range of topics that they cover, the types of stories that they're publishing. I mean, there's so much work being done in this space. I would say contemporary is getting there. It's like edging really closely, but I feel like all that's just going. I feel like with romance, you're gonna see most of the change with indie romances and
Yeah.
indie historicals before you see a traditional published. So I'm like, and you already see. I know some couple of indie romance authors that do feature like Asian heroines, interracial. historical romances. So they're getting there, but definitely for the casual reader, you would not know that they're there unless you did a ton of research.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you said indie romances, because a lot of this is really the expectation of the romance reader, because I think in a live show, Kerrigan Byrne had even said that she feels like she has more creative liberty when it comes to her indie romances versus what's a traditionally published romance, because they're trying to make things marketable. So as a romance reader, you really have to, like you said, support what you want to be seen, so that we can kind of not have it always be indie, and we can see those traditionally published books that are more diverse and not so focused on like the nitty-gritty details of keeping things historically accurate. Because, like, to be completely honest, I'm not interested in reading about problematic elements. So I read a Viking romance by Johanna Lindsay, and I ended up giving like 1 or 2 stars because there were major consent issues. And a lot of people in the comments said that, oh, that should get like a free pass essentially because it's historically accurate. That's how Vikings were during that time. And I'm like, I don't want to read about.
No, sorry.
Yeah.
For a genre that's being like mainly marketed towards women, like with their satisfaction in mind, like that's not a good pass to give a story. Like even though I know that was probably popular during that time, like that's why I'm scared to like read historicals past the 2000s, because like you never know what you're gonna be getting in those books. It's like dubious, like it's not even dubious. It's just like
no, yeah.
It's like I like to consider it dubious, but I'm like, is it really?
We're being generous, giving them the benefit of the doubt, but really, it's just straight up no consent. So if if you're asking for historical accuracy and that's what you're getting, why do you want to read about that? That's not romantic. That's never been romantic. So I think we can just do better, and we can create the stories that we want to see, and that make people happy. So that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, I think in general this conversation has been like really, really amazing, because we basically kind of just said like, yes, historical romances should be more diverse, but on the other side, like it all depends on like what you're looking for from the historical romance, from what the author's trying to do. They don't always have to give you the historical context. We're more reading romance for the entertainment value.
Exactly.
And to experience the romance, to experience the chemistry, the banter, like the steaminess of the book. And so like that's our main goals. And I feel like if we don't get that, but yet we get a super historically accurate book, like imagine if you read a book where it was pretty much all dubious consent, no consent was given at all. The heroine is basically just forced into it because she has no rights during this time period. It's really depressing. She has no agency. I'm like, you're basically describing a dark romance that will be published nowadays that may turn off some readers. So I'm like, it's not, like you said, it's just not romantic, and we want the romance. And it's great if we get those extra bonuses, but I'm not going to question the validity if I have like a Chinese hero and like a heroine from Argentina or something like that. I wouldn't question it. I'd be like, oh, that's cool. Like, that's dope.
Exactly.
I'm like, I don't care. Like, you don't have to stress it.
And we also need to think about like what history are we even being taught at this point? Because like you said, Black people, they were having their love stories. Asian people, they were having their love stories. Just because you weren't hearing about them doesn't mean it's not happening. I think that's what people need to think about as well. So it's so much more than potatoes and all of this stuff. Like, I honestly think if you're so focused on the validity of the historical accuracy, then the author didn't do a really good job creating that romance, that you're not more interested in the character development.
That is so true. That is, you summarized it better than I could ever have done. Like, that's why I was like, I need Samantha on this video. Like, she will be like go-to historical guru, because I don't know crap about historical romances. I read them. Like, you asked me about time periods, I'm like, I don't really know. Like, is it Jane Austen inspired? Probably, yeah. Or is it some like random, like, I'm a wallflower, I'm not good looking, but yet they're like a beautiful heroine. And the hero's like, oh, let me be damaged. Let's put them in compromising situations.
Yeah.
So like, I'm not the go-to expert on historicals, but any final thoughts before I wrap us up?
Just that historical romance can be diverse, and I think it is interesting to read things from different time periods, and just be more focused on like the love story. Like, convince me of the couple. You don't need to convince me of the setting. That's how I feel.
Mhm. And I 100% agree. I want diversity, and it does not have to be explained to me in my historical romances. It could just be like, even in Bridgerton, they didn't even have to address it, but they did, like, in one tiny scene. They
Right.
addressed the reason why, but like, other than that, it was just, this is what goes. I think the second season, they cast a Middle Eastern actress as Kate, I
Oh, she's
think.
beautiful. I don't know.
I
Um,
don't know. I know
but
she's
she's
British.
gorgeous.
I think she's British. I think.
Yeah, I think so.
I
I
don't
think
know. I know her from like another show, but I'm not quite not sure. But like, even with that, I'm like, that's already a huge departure from the books. I'm like, you're
yeah.
having like interracial romances, and it's just kind of like normalized. I'm like, that's all I'm asking for. Just put it in there. Don't explain it. If you want to explain it, great. If you want to make up a historical reason that it's there, like, you can do that as well. But if you guys want some of the best historical recommendations, as well as cozy mystery, which I do not touch, but like, that's Samantha's jam. Like, I've seen them all over the place, and I'm just like, no, no,
I'll convince
I don't think
you.
so. But if you want those good recs, go to Samantha's channel. I'll link all her stuff down in the description box down below. So you definitely guys should go subscribe to her. She does amazing videos, like, range from historical, just all types of romance and makeup videos. So like, you beauty gurus slash book people, that's if that's your thing, you can get that at Samantha's channel. But thank you again, Samantha, so much for coming on my channel and talking about me with this topic. Like, I wouldn't have been able to do this video without you. So thank you again. And then I will catch you guys all of a brand new video. Bye, everyone.
Bye.